Why did Cormac McCarthy write books that feature a pre industrial world without electricity or barely any electricity? Well, today we are going to hear McCarthy talk about this at length in an unreleased interview where he discusses writing more candidly than any other time in his life. And I think today we are going to dispel the myth that McCarthy doesn't like to talk about writing. I just think that he avoided interviews in general or gave them to people who wouldn't ask about his writing. Lawrence Krauss, David Krakauer, they are scientists. They wanted to talk science with Cormac. But in these interview segments I will be releasing over the upcoming months, McCarthy feels very comfortable talking about his writing process. And this interview right now is available exclusively on Right Conscious, which is the headquarters of everything related to Cormac McCarthy here on YouTube. I already have 150 videos related to McCarthy down below, so go check out some of those when we finish this one. And let us now hear from McCarthy. The interviewer asks, do you have any explanation as to why, as I said to you last night as well, that in your books, electricity barely exists? Do you have the that in some ways it's a pre-industrial world, that all of them exist? And McCarthy replies, no, only except I think it's probably easier to write about human issues if they are not cluttered up with paraphernalia of modern living. It's just a matter of making things simple and direct and accessible. For the same reason I think that people's lives are. You know, you think about, would it be better if you lived 100 years ago? And in a lot of ways, it would have been simpler. You know, just of course, with what we know now, we would find the time and boredom and support of it. But if we don't know about having around cars and airplanes and watching television and listening to rock music, you have to ask what price you pay for these things and what price you pay in being separated from direct access to your own existence. A glimpse into some of the negative aspects of modern existence. We have the government tank in The Orchard Keeper, which leads to everyone's downfall in the novel. We have the Jaguar in Suttree, which shows him bottoming out from actual growth and from the actual individuation that eventually occurs in the novel. In the Border trilogy, we have the nuclear test and many other things. And in McCarthy studies, these symbols have made it obvious to scholars and to us that McCarthy is pretty anti-technology. And this quote really reaffirms that. But even crazier, when we look at a lot of McCarthy's characters, they lack interiority. And that's why we love him. Not many other authors out there, outside of like weird minimalists, write characters like McCarthy does. But it isn't a coincidence that most of McCarthy's books take place before 1950 without the modern paraphernalia, because if we add modern paraphernalia in and modern existence, hyper interiority almost comes with that. Even McCarthy understands this because in No Country for Old Men, we have Sheriff Bell, who shows more interiority than a lot of other, than really any McCarthy character. Even in The Passenger with Bobby and Alicia Western, they are showing interiority because they exist much later in time. And to give an extreme example so that you guys can picture this, imagine writing a story about a queer person living in New York City who is addicted to Adderall and loves to protest. But you didn't feature any interiority. It wouldn't work because going back to Dostoevsky and obviously before him, and then going to Proust, then going to almost every single major novel and trend that we've experienced in our lifetime, they experience a ton of interiority. The characters in those novels, that is. And speaking of Proust and Tolstoy, have you ever wondered how Cormac McCarthy became such a great author? Well, he read 8 to 10 books a week for years of his life, and I have assembled the most comprehensive list of Cormac McCarthy's favorite authors and books for free for you. There are over 144 in total on this list. And all you have to do is go to the link down in the description below, click on it, and you will be taken to a Google Doc with all of this literary potential and motivation waiting for you to suck it dry. But what makes those characters interesting is that I don't feel like they are grappling with life's issues. McCarthy's characters who don't think about anything are somehow, when you look at them deep enough, and it kind of ties to Hemingway's iceberg theory, are all going through these existential crises. McCarthy's works show Rene Girard's theory of mimetic desire better than any other novelist I know. And this comes back to the idea, though, of what are we writing for? And this is why McCarthy was a fan of Tolstoy, even a fan of Dostoevsky, because They cared about solving the big problems with their work. When you read a McCarthy novel or War and Peace, you are going to have your life transformed. If I read Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, you can see I've read this 2 times. I'm going to enjoy it. I'm going to have my mind expanded, especially about writing and about characters, and enjoy myself. But I'm most likely going to be the same person after. And Neil Stephenson is one of the better, modern authors. And McCarthy is also a genius because I don't know if anyone out here has read Proust. And we are going to talk about why McCarthy hates Proust because he does speak on it at length in this unreleased interview. But as you are reading In Search of Lost Time, you understand it's great writing. You're like, damn, this guy's pretty good, especially for the time. But then it starts to become a slog because you're like, holy hell, I'm inside some dude's head who is just reminiscing on shit going on in 1900. I don't care. Dostoevsky's characters, when they are reminiscing, they are thinking, they're like, they're being weird. And it relates to our own existence and our own thoughts. I can see myself in his characters. But with Proust, you're like, oh my God, this is so boring because it feels very disconnected for me. But maybe if I was reading something like An Infinite Jest, which features a lot of Proustian interiority at a extreme level, it could be more fun because, there's that famous chapter, chapter 2, where we are hearing from this like crazy marijuana addict, and I can relate to some of that. But maybe a Christian or a normie who's never, done drugs at an extreme level, they are like, what the hell is this? But with McCarthy's characters, we all can connect to them. And by placing his characters in this liminal space in the between the world of technology and the primitive world, like obviously Blood Meridian takes place without any technology in the Wild West, but most of McCarthy's books do have some form of technology. There are cars, medicine, these types of things, but not full-blown diners filled with greasers. And I think it's the perfect mix because McCarthy's characters can be outlandish. They can be sexist, racist, these types of things. And we just kind of accept it because, like, oh, yeah, that's just the time. But as soon as we kind of hit that time where there's technology in these things, we kind of put our frowny faces on and be like, no, that character can't do that. That person is bad. So McCarthy squeezes all these little weird things in. And he asks us, he says, quote, you think about, would it be better if you lived 100 years ago? And in a lot of ways, it would have been simpler. And when we look at McCarthy's second novel, Outer Dark, in the first couple of pages, so this really isn't a spoiler, one of the characters, Renthi, has a free birth, and the only person to help her is a detached man who doesn't want the baby anyway. And I like this example because 90% of the people out there watching right now are men. But when we read the end of the quote, McCarthy says, what price do you pay for these things? And what price do you pay in being separated from direct access to your own existence? And when we look at the modern industrial obstetric system complex, most women have been removed from the rite of passage of birth. They get thrown into a hospital room on their back with bright lights, with a bunch of stress and fear all around them. And they're disconnected from the psychedelic or the transformative aspects of nature because they are given an epidural and all these different things. And if that's what you want to do and you believe in that, that's okay. But we have been programmed and trained and made fearful. I shouldn't say we, I should say women, to think that that's the only way. But this is an extreme example that relates to the physical body, so it's very easy to talk about. But most of the choices we make as humans in the technological era that we think are helping us weren't our choices in the first place. They were basically forced upon us. And if we want to escape, that consensual reality, we have to take like a bottle full of red pills. And then our only reward for tapping into our own existence, maybe questioning some of these things, is further isolation, having to deal with the 90 whatever percent of people who are still caught up in that reality. And because they are in a state of fear, look back at us or look toward us with anger, resentment, all of these things. I know many of you guys have experienced this before. And this is McCarthy talking, the scientist, the man who loves technological innovation. I've been teaching now for 7 years, and every single year, the kids have gotten less intelligent, less healthy, and less happy. When I first started, I would occasionally hear or have to have a meeting about a child having a mental health issue or something, and that's okay. Like, that's common. Someone had a breakdown or something, cool. But now, 20, 30 times a year, if not more, this is happening. And because everything exists on these crazy contrasts and polarities, on one side, we have people who are having breakdowns, and then the response to that is normalcy, is, TikTok fever, just acting normal, worrying what everyone's thinking about you, becoming overly self-conscious, walking down the hallway with the phone with the selfie screen on and looking at yourself and fixing your hair and wondering what you look like when you're actually existing in the moment. And a real observer like myself is looking at you and being like, it's weirder to be staring at yourself in your phone than if one of your pieces of hair is messed up. And McCarthy's opinion on this stems from his connection to nature because he mentions cars and airplanes right here. Because as I talked about in my David Foster Wallace on tourism video and all throughout my spiritual ecology course, most people out there, 99% of people, have no idea what's happening even in their local area in terms of the terrain and the fauna, the flora, the animal life, the different valleys and things around them. And they want to go to Cancun or to Bali or Yellowstone this summer, but they've never put any time exploring the places around them, and thus they don't understand who they really are. Because of course the environment has an effect on us, even if you are a totally atheist and objective person. If you are living in Phoenix, you're going to be a different person than if you are living in Maine. We say out in the middle of the desert, out in the middle of the woods, or in Alaska, or in the rainforest. It just inherently kind of makes you different and act differently. But with the invention of cars, we can bypass a lot of this terrain. If I had to ride on horseback to the grocery store or to work every single day, I would have an understanding of the rattlesnakes and the different cactuses out here in the desert at a deeper level. And this, kind of lends itself to the argument of closing down all state and national parks for car travel and making everybody walk to the sites, because we would be much more grateful and it would be much more beautiful, even if you are someone who's connected to nature, to have to work to go out and see Old Faithful or something like that. And even worse are airplanes. Cars, you can literally skip an environment. I can get in a car and in 10 hours be from the desert to Salt Lake City. I can get in an airplane and in 12 hours be in Japan. And McCarthy has such a beautiful idea with this because in the Border trilogy, we have these characters who are seeking this, but they are in a land that's been infected with evil. They are around the areas where the Glanton gang were rolling through. Chihuahua and Sonora in the 1940s and 50s didn't become some paradise overnight. Oh, wait, Chihuahua and Sonora and Baja, Mexico are still problematic. 3 surfers just died yesterday or the day before. And when we look across McCarthy's bibliography, a lot of characters are actually running away from their own existence. The Border trilogy, not so much. One could say. But when we look at Outer Dark, it's a road novel. They are fleeing from reality and going on this journey. In The Orchard Keeper, the characters are having to deal with the government. One of the characters has this car that's kind of this symbol, an anti-conscious symbol. In Child the God, Lester Ballard is failing to conform with existence. Same with Suttree. He wants to just live the old ways. He wants to live on his houseboat and fish every single day, but we're starting to move closer and closer to the 1950s and the 1960s. Not necessarily in that novel, but just in the timeline of reality. And there are no houseboats, in downtown Knoxville anymore. But Suttree is avoiding direct access to himself by going off on all these different journeys with Harrigan, going to jail, and going clam fishing, and all the million different side quests throughout the novel. And he makes multiple kind of false start attempts, like going to the mountains. No really spoilers here, but he makes attempts, like most characters do throughout novels, to become more conscious. And they fail for a while, and maybe he does, or maybe he doesn't. We'll never know. And it's interesting that McCarthy also mentions rock music here because he has been known to play hillbilly music, as he calls it, which is country, old school country. But McCarthy was 36 when the hippie revolution was kicking off. And when you are 36 years old and you're looking back at the youth, most of the time you're at this really nice medium where you aren't too old to be disconnected, but you're wise enough to see through some of the cracks. And there is a very famous book that was released in 1987 called The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom. And this is a very controversial book, but Bloom was an early whistleblower talking about how oncoming technology and stuff is going to ruin the youth in the education system. But Bloom has a whole chapter on why rock music is bad. And I'm not a Christian. I'm not saying rock music is satanic. I love rock music, metal music, all these different things. But we have to go back, first of all, to the 60s. And when you look at the 60s and how the CIA and the government government was involved with radio and with media and even with certain rock groups and with the creation really of the hippie movement, which was kind of a deliberate attempt to make a movement that would act like they are doing something but not do anything at all. Because if the hippie movement was a militant movement, then the Vietnam War wouldn't have continued. But a bunch of people protesting at Woodstock and kind of this relaxed, nonviolent methodology is somewhat akin to why Christianity, I think, has reigned so well, just kind of going off on a side tangent, because if we embody the energy of Jesus and what we're supposed to and what the church tells us to do, we're not going to necessarily be revolutionaries. We're not going to push back. We're because, Christians have been infused with forgiveness and mercy, and that was a good thing because obviously pagan religions and stuff were much more problematic, and Christ consciousness needed to kind of come into the forefront of the Western mind so that we could progress. But having that continue at some level led to further oppression and whatnot. Anyway, so there is a direct connection to rock music and intelligence agencies, and they were pushing it onto the people for a reason. And Bloom doesn't get into the CIA and rock music, but he talks about 20 years in retrospect what happened and what was happening currently in the 80s. And rock music in the 1980s, like New Order, like the new wave bands of the late 1980s, seem like nothing compared to EDM or cloud rap or like anything weird or anime fan music or whatever the hell is going on now. Like that stuff is like high consciousness. That's high art compared to a lot of the music that people are consuming now with pop. Like pop music back in the 80s was Heart, Alone by Heart or something like that was on the radio. And you could consider that real music still. But Bloom talks about how rock music inflates sensuality and narcissism to the frontal levels of consciousness. And this somewhat coincides with what's happened with America's youth by making it the all about me movement. When you look at teenagers, like when I'm trying to communicate with teenagers in my classroom, the number one obstacle has always been that they are in this kind of self-centered reality. Everything revolves around them. Their parents have to take them to school. They have to get good grades. It's their future. It's all about them. And as an adult, you guys understand that that's not necessarily the case. I mean, you do care about yourself and your own future, but the whole world doesn't revolve around you unless like you're a weirdo and like make that happen. But this isn't inherent to teenagers. In time immemorial, teenagers across all different religions and cultures served the parents, served the community, and they basically went along with what the parents were doing. Even in somewhat of modern society, if we go back to the early 1900s, maybe kids would go to school, but they would come home and they would be with their parents. They would be following along. The parents wouldn't be like, Johnny needs to go to baseball practice and do this. We have to do all this. The life wasn't centered around the kid. It was centered around, this is what we need to do around the farm, or this is what we want to do. This is what our family does. And this breeds, teenagers and adults that are less narcissistic. And so as that started to change, as the education system started to reform with John Dewey and other people, and then we add rock music, which does with its boom clap signature evoke base consciousness, because when you look at classical music and Indian classical music and stuff like that, it's not a boom clap. There's there's multiple harmonies happening at once, and what that does is create a certain response in the brain that is positive. But the boom clap, which connects to tribal society and stuff, is good for putting you into a trance state, but it's not good for focus and necessarily higher thinking. I mean, a mystical state, if it's gotten, could lead you to higher thinking, but when you're listening to rock music or rap music or something like that, that's boom clap, most of the time you're not using it as a meditative portal to access higher consciousness. And so what you're doing is entering a hyper impressionable state where everything around you can melt into your consciousness much better. But when you look around your room, if you are in a hyper suggestible state and you look at your phone or you just look at everything around you, or consensual reality of your suburban home, then it's going to be a net negative in the long run. If you're out in nature and like doing something like that, then okay, that's kind of the point of boom clap. But also returning to rock music, and this is not necessarily true, but it does somewhat lead to intellectual simplicity. Once again, when we look at people who play classical music or Indian classical or any of those, they're just a different type of person. Once again, just like where you live changes you, the type of music that you engage in constantly over the course of decades is going to change who you are. And this is why we see a difference between even like a Bob Dylan, who was a revolutionary and, had a different type of demeanor than like the Rolling Stones or the Grateful Dead, who came a couple years after him. When you're sitting and playing, Fire on the Mountain for 30 minutes a night, to a crowd on acid and you're on acid, it's going to be much different than like Bob Dylan, who for a long time didn't even interact with the crowd. He would just walk up there and do no crowd work and would just play his music and leave. And this channel is called Right Conscious because I want you guys to be aware of some of the negative exchanges you are making in your writing and lifestyle by bringing technology in. And I think that's where the power of things like a dopamine fast could come into play, because then you could see how certain aspects of technology or music or these types of things are affecting you, because rock music or anything else, including just getting pumped up or watching a cool movie or getting too into a book, can spike your dopamine and thus, lead to less focus and problems further on down the road. And so I advocate for that on this channel all the time, but you could do a dopamine fast, but with your writing. Why not try to write about things that aren't so schizo? I know people and they write the craziest sci-fi or fantasy or all these things, and their story is so inundated with the setting and the world building and these different technologies and all this stuff that I feel like they get lost from the plot, or they are too Proustian. We get way too into the head or world of something that doesn't actually matter. And so returning to meaning, maybe writing some poetry, doing something that is short, powerful, and disconnected from this world. I think I've just came up with this right now. I think that could be something valuable for writers, and maybe I will try that. And this is good if you are just obviously working on a novel like I am that's set in 1900 before technology was a big deal, but I will explore that idea further in the future. So, what prices have you guys had to pay from being disconnected from your own existence? Comment down below. I'd love to read your comments. I read them all. They help me out a lot. You guys obviously make me more intelligent, but also help me feel more, help me see where I'm wrong. So many different things. I tell my wife all the time, I'm like, dude, who the hell are in my comments? Like, some of you guys are really kind, really supportive, like make my day. Some of you guys are geniuses. I'm like, dude, if these guys got on a microphone and started talking, I'd be out of work. I would get 20 views a video. So thank you for being such a supportive fan base. That has honestly changed my life. And I will see you guys in another video, hopefully dropping tomorrow, from the unreleased interview.